The fight that never happened, and why it haunts us forever. There is a story that floats around the internet like smoke through an open window. Sometimes it is told with photographs, AI-generated, convincing enough to fool people who want to believe. Sometimes it is told in comment sections, in hushed forum posts, in the kind of message boards where martial arts diehards debate things no one else will ever care about at 2 in the morning. The story goes like this. Somewhere, sometime, behind locked doors, in a room that only a handful of witnesses ever entered, Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali faced each other. 7 people saw it. Only 7. And every single one of them swore they would take the secret to their graves. It is a beautiful story. It is also not true. But here is the thing about beautiful stories: they do not survive for decades simply because people are gullible. They survive because they are built on something real. They survive because the 2 men at the center of them were so extraordinary, so impossibly skilled, so far beyond the limits of what human beings were supposed to be capable of, that the imagination refuses to accept they were never in the same room together. And when you start digging into the actual documented history of Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali, who they were, what they stood for, how they thought about each other, and how their legacies became permanently tangled even though they never met, you start to understand why this particular myth has more staying power than almost any other in the history of combat sports. So today we are going to do something better than repeat the myth. We are going to tell you the true story. Because the truth, as it turns out, is stranger and more fascinating than anything a rumor could deliver. The truth involves a secret punch passed between legends like a flame. It involves a man standing in front of a mirror at 3 in the morning, throwing combinations at his own reflection. It involves one of the greatest fighters who ever lived saying, out loud, in front of a camera, that another man, a man he outweighed by more than 60 pounds, would kill him in a real fight. And it ends with both men leaving something behind that is still shaping the way humans think about movement, speed, and violence half a century after they were gone. Let's start at the beginning. The little dragon Bruce Lee came into the world in San Francisco on November 27, 1940. Born in the hour of the dragon and the year of the dragon, a coincidence his parents noted and his fans never forgot. His father was a Hong Kong opera singer touring the United States, and within months of Bruce's birth, the family returned to Hong Kong, where the boy who would become the most famous martial artist in history grew up in the dense, complicated streets of Kowloon. He was not a quiet child. He got into street fights. He ran with gangs. By his early teens he had accumulated enough bruises and embarrassments that his family decided he needed direction, and they found it in the form of a slight, elderly man named IP Man, a Wing Chun grandmaster who taught out of a rooftop school in Hong Kong and who would, without fully realizing it, set in motion a chain of events that would change the way the entire world thought about combat. Wing Chun is a close-quarter system that prizes economy above everything else. No wasted movement. No decoration. Every technique exists because it works, and if it stops working, you throw it away and find something that does. Bruce took to it with a ferocity that surprised even IP Man. He trained until his hands bled. He trained through sickness and heat. He trained the way some people pray, with total commitment, and with the conviction that something essential was being revealed to him. He was also being educated by the streets. Before and after his Wing Chun sessions, he was involved in real fights, genuine altercations with real consequences, and those experiences taught him something Wing Chun alone could not, that real combat is chaos, not choreography, and that any system rigid enough to feel like a style is already rigid enough to fail. In 1959, Lee moved to the United States. He was 18 years old, carrying one suit, $100 in cash, and a philosophy of fighting that had no formal name yet. He settled in Seattle, began teaching martial arts to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of race, which made him genuinely radical at a time when Chinese masters generally refused to teach non-Chinese students, and started incorporating what he was seeing in American boxing gyms into his thinking. In 1964, at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in California, Bruce Lee demonstrated something he called the one-inch punch to a live audience for the first time. A man standing 245 pounds watched Bruce Lee's fist connect with his chest from a distance of roughly 1 inch and found himself driven backward across the floor and into a chair. The audience was silent for a moment before erupting. No one had seen anything like it. Not the mechanics of it, and certainly not the person performing it, this small, electric Chinese-American man who moved like he had been built specifically for the purpose of generating force. It was also at that 1964 tournament that Lee met a South Korean taekwondo master named Jun Ri, a man who would quietly become the living bridge between Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali. But we will get to that. The next 7 years of Lee's life were a period of relentless refinement. He abandoned Wing Chun, or rather, he absorbed it and moved beyond it. He began studying every fighting system he could access. Fencing for its footwork and distance management, wrestling for its principles of leverage, Western boxing for the mechanics of power generation and head movement. He devoured film footage of Sugar Ray Robinson and Sugar Ray Leonard. He watched boxing matches the way film students watch Kubrick, analytically, obsessively, looking not at the event but at the structure underneath the event. And he watched Muhammad Ali. In 1967, Lee formalized his thinking into a philosophy he called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It was not a style. It was the rejection of style. It was the argument, made entirely in movement, that the best fighter is whoever can adapt. That the most dangerous person in any room is the one with no fixed form, because a fixed form can be studied and defeated, while formlessness cannot. The name he gave it, he later admitted, was a mistake. By naming it, he had inadvertently made it sound like another style, when his whole point was that it was the opposite of style. By 1971, Lee had returned to Hong Kong and was becoming famous in a way that no martial artist before him had ever been famous. His films were shattering box office records across Asia. The world was paying attention. And in a studio somewhere in Hong Kong, while preparing for what would become Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee was standing in front of a full-length mirror, watching Muhammad Ali move, and throwing combinations at his own reflection. The greatest Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. in Louisville, Kentucky, on January 17, 1942. He started boxing at 12, after his bicycle was stolen, and he told the officer who took his report, a man who also ran a boxing gym, that he wanted to fight the thief. The officer told him to learn to fight first. He learned fast. By 18, he was an Olympic gold medalist, winning the light heavyweight title at the 1960 Rome Games. By 22, he was heavyweight champion of the world, having knocked out Sonny Liston, the most feared man in boxing at the time, in one of the great upsets in sports history. The day after winning that title, he announced that he had joined the Nation of Islam, and that his name was no longer Cassius Clay. His name was Muhammad Ali. That declaration alone was enough to make him one of the most controversial athletes in American history. And then, in 1967, at the absolute peak of his powers, Ali refused induction into the United States Army, citing his religious beliefs and his opposition to the Vietnam War. They stripped him of his title. They suspended his license. They banned him from boxing in every state in the country for nearly 4 years, years that covered what should have been the finest stretch of his athletic life. He was not finished. But he was changed. When he returned to the ring in October 1970, the legs that had once allowed him to dance for 15 rounds without stopping were not quite the same legs. His reflexes, while still exceptional, had lost something immeasurable. He was still Muhammad Ali, still faster, smarter, and more durable than nearly anyone alive, but the fighter who came back was slightly different from the fighter who had been taken away. On March 8, 1971, Ali stepped into Madison Square Garden for what was being called the fight of the century. Two undefeated fighters, both with legitimate claims to the heavyweight title, Ali and Joe Frazier. The fight went 15 rounds. In the final round, Frazier dropped Ali with a left hook that Ali would later say was the hardest he had ever been hit. Ali got up. He finished the fight. But the judges gave it to Frazier, and Muhammad Ali had his first professional loss after 31 wins. He would go on to reclaim the title, twice, against Frazier, against George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle, in a career that produced some of the most remarkable performances in the history of sport. But it is worth fixing him in this particular moment, in 1971, at the age of 29, already carrying the weight of 4 years of exile and still one of the most physically extraordinary human beings on the planet. Because it is in this period, roughly 1971 to 1973, that the story of Ali and Bruce Lee runs closest together, even though the two men were living entirely parallel lives on opposite sides of the world. The fascination ran almost entirely in one direction, and Bruce Lee was the one doing the watching. Director Robert Clouse, who directed Enter the Dragon in 1973, recorded a scene in his book about the making of that film. He described watching Bruce Lee set up a full-length mirror in his studio at Golden Harvest to reflect the image of a Muhammad Ali documentary playing on the screen. Frame by frame, Ali throwing combinations on screen, Bruce throwing the same combinations in the mirror. Ali's right hand moved, and Bruce's right hand followed. Ali's left foot stepped, and Bruce's left foot stepped. He was fighting in Ali's body, studying it from the inside. The reason why matters. Ali was, by the early 1970s, widely considered the fastest heavyweight in the history of boxing. His footwork was the subject of genuine scientific attention. One analysis conducted by members of Mike Tyson's training team using frame synchronization concluded that Ali's footwork at his prime was faster than any other boxer on film, not just in the heavyweight division, but across all weight classes. He moved like a welterweight trapped in a heavyweight's body. He could throw a jab from a position where no jab was supposed to be possible, at a moment when his opponent thought he was safely out of range. Bruce Lee understood this viscerally. He had built Jeet Kune Do partly around the concept of intercepting, of moving before the opponent's attack had completed itself, of acting inside the window of human reaction time rather than waiting for an opening to develop. Ali, Lee could see, was doing something philosophically similar from the opposite direction. Where Lee was building toward an attacking system that couldn't be anticipated, Ali had built a defensive system that couldn't be tracked. They were, in a sense, working from the same underlying principle toward different expressions of it. There are accounts from multiple people who knew Bruce Lee personally during this period. Dan Inosanto, his closest student and designated steward of Jeet Kune Do after Lee's death, actor Jim Kelly, who starred alongside Lee in Enter the Dragon, multiple members of Lee's Hong Kong production team, all describing the same pattern. Lee was obsessed with Ali. Not with defeating him. Not with comparing himself to him. With understanding him. When people kept asking Lee who would win if the two of them ever fought, Lee's answer was consistent and completely unambiguous. He pointed to his hand. A small hand. A Chinese hand. And he said, "He would kill me." That answer has been verified by his daughter Shannon Lee, by his close friend and training partner Dan Inosanto, and by screenwriter Sterling Siliphant, one of his private students. It was not false modesty. Bruce Lee did not do false modesty. It was an honest assessment from a man who had spent years studying the mechanics of combat and had concluded, with the same rigorous thinking he applied to everything, that Muhammad Ali represented a category of physical danger he had no reliable answer to. The 65-pound weight difference was part of it. Ali's reach, a 6'3" frame with arms that could keep a small, fast man at a distance no punch could close, was part of it. But it was also something harder to quantify. Ali was not merely a skilled boxer. Ali was the most decorated, most tested, most ring-proven heavyweight in history. He had been hit by Sonny Liston and kept moving. He had been dropped by Joe Frazier and gotten up. He had absorbed punishment that would have ended most men's careers and simply refused to acknowledge it. Bruce Lee was honest enough with himself to respect that. He studied Ali the way a chess master studies a game he has never won, with admiration and with the implicit acknowledgement that the person on the other side of the board has earned their position. The bridge. Jun Ri in the acupunch. There is one documented, verified, genuinely remarkable moment in which Bruce Lee's fighting knowledge and Muhammad Ali's fighting body actually intersected. It did not happen in a ring. It happened in a training camp in Deer Park, Pennsylvania, in 1975, 2 years after Bruce Lee had died. The man carrying Bruce Lee's technique into that camp was Jun Ri, the Korean-born grandmaster widely known as the father of American Taekwondo. Ri had first met Bruce Lee at the 1964 Long Beach Championships, the same event where Lee had demonstrated the 1-inch punch. The two men were drawn to each other immediately. Ri was 32 at the time, Lee was 23, and they had the kind of meeting between martial artists that rarely happens, one where both people feel they have found someone who is genuinely thinking about the same things at the same level. Their relationship lasted nearly a decade, through exchanged letters and regular visits, until Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973, at the age of 32. Jun Ri was one of the last people in America to speak to him. He received a phone call from Lee the day before his death. When he heard the news the following morning, Ri was devastated. He attended the funeral in Seattle alongside Steve McQueen, James Coburn, and others who had been part of Lee's circle. What Ri had received from Bruce Lee during those 9 years of friendship was a punching technique unlike anything in traditional Taekwondo. Lee had taught Ri what would eventually be called the acupunch, a strike designed around the concept of human reaction time. The human nervous system takes approximately 0.25 seconds to process a visual stimulus and initiate a physical response. The acupunch was built around the idea of completing the entire punch inside that window, launching, traveling, and landing before the opponent's brain has even registered that the attack has begun. There is no telegraph, no loading, no preparation visible from the outside. The fist simply arrives. Ri incorporated this technique into his own teaching and named it. Then, in 1975, before the Thrilla in Manila, Ali's third and final fight with Joe Frazier, Ri went to Ali's training camp and demonstrated it. Ali watched Ri throw the punch. He tried to block it. He could not. He asked Ri to show him again. He tried to block it again. He still could not. Ali asked to be taught. He used the acupunch in the Thrilla in Manila, and he used it again the following year against British heavyweight champion Richard Dunn, for the knockout blow. Afterward, in an interview, Ali explained the punch to a reporter who had played back the footage in slow motion. The punch moved at tremendous speed with no warning, Ali said. No lag time. It acts at the exact moment you decide to hit. A reporter asked him where it came from. That is Jun Ri's acupunch, Ali said. And Jun Ri had learned it from Bruce Lee. So the two men who never met, who existed on opposite sides of a fascination that only ran in one direction during their lifetimes, are permanently connected by this sequence of transmission. Bruce Lee's technique, carried by Jun Ri, delivered by Muhammad Ali's fist, in a championship fight that was broadcast around the world. It is real. It is documented. It is more than most myths ever managed to produce as evidence. The physics of Bruce Lee. To understand why the myth of a secret fight between these two men persists so powerfully, it helps to understand what Bruce Lee was actually capable of, the documented, measured, scientifically reviewed reality of his physical abilities. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed approximately 61 kilograms at his peak. By any conventional measure of what a fighter is supposed to look like, he was undersized. And yet the numbers attached to his physical performance read like something generated by a calculator that has been fed incorrect inputs. His punching speed has been measured at approximately 190 kilometers per hour. To give that number context, that is comparable to a high-speed train, concentrated into an area no larger than the first two knuckles of a clenched fist. At the 1964 Long Beach Championships, his 1-inch punch sent a man weighing 245 pounds sliding backward into a chair. The biomechanics of that technique were later analyzed by researchers at Stanford University and Imperial College London. The conclusion was that the power did not come from Lee's arm muscles alone, but from the synchronized kinetic chain running from his feet, through his knees and hips, through his torso and shoulder, into his arm, with his wrist snapping at the final moment to further accelerate the fist at the point of contact. The neuroscience research found that practitioners capable of this level of short-range power generation had measurably different white matter structures in the supplementary motor cortex, the region of the brain responsible for coordinating multi-limb movement. In other words, Bruce Lee's brain was literally wired differently from ordinary human brains in the specific area that governs the kind of explosive, coordinated, full-body movement he was famous for. He could perform a side kick that generated force comparable to a heavyweight punch. He could throw punches in sequences that, in early footage of his demonstrations, had to be played back in slow motion for audiences to follow. He claimed, and no credible witness ever disputed the claim, that he could snatch a dime off a person's open palm and replace it with a penny before the hand could close. And yet he was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 61 kilograms. And Muhammad Ali was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed over 95 kilograms at his prime. Ali had a reach that extended his punching range well beyond where Lee would have needed to be to land his most effective techniques. Ali's jab alone, which traveled at speeds measured as the fastest ever recorded for any boxer at any weight, in any era, would have presented a challenge that no martial arts training was specifically designed to address. Bruce Lee's own analysis of this problem was characteristically clear-eyed. His system, Jeet Kune Do, was built around intercepting, moving inside the opponent's attack before it completed. But against Ali, the problem was that Ali's attack almost never fully committed. Ali's famous rope-a-dope strategy, his constant lateral movement, his ability to pull his head back just far enough to let a punch pass without actually retreating, these were not simply skills. They were a philosophy of combat as sophisticated, in its own language, as anything Bruce Lee had developed. Against an opponent who never gave you a clean attack to intercept, interception becomes enormously difficult. This is not to say the outcome was obvious or certain. Real fights between elite practitioners of different disciplines are always unpredictable. It is to say that Bruce Lee was right to be honest about it, and his honesty tells you something about who he was. The great debate for the better part of 5 decades, martial arts enthusiasts have been arguing about who would win a hypothetical fight between Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali. The debate has produced more heat than light, mostly because it tends to be conducted by people who love one or the other, and have therefore already decided their answer before engaging any of the evidence. But the more interesting question, the one that the people who actually knew these men tend to gravitate toward when asked, is not who would win. It is what would happen. What would it look like? What would each man discover about himself in the presence of the other? Ali was fascinated by martial arts in general. He had met Jun Rhee, he had trained with Rhee, he had incorporated martial arts techniques into his boxing. Before the bout with Antonio Inoki in 1976, a strange, controversial mixed-rules match between Ali and a professional wrestler, Ali expressed genuine curiosity about what martial arts practitioners could do that boxers couldn't. He was not dismissive. He was interested. And Bruce Lee's widow, Linda Lee Cadwell, wrote in her memoir in 1975 that observers who had watched Lee fight argued he would have had an advantage against Ali in a no-rules environment, not because Lee was necessarily faster or stronger, but because Ali had spent his entire career operating within the specific rules and structures of boxing. Remove the ring, remove the rounds, remove the Queensberry rules, and Ali's primary advantages become less certain. His footwork, still extraordinary, no longer serves the same defensive function when an opponent can also kick, sweep, or strike from angles a boxer is not trained to defend. That argument has its own counter-arguments, of course, chief among them that the size and weight differential in a real fight with no rules is not a disadvantage that technique fully neutralizes. A 95-kilogram man with Ali's level of training is still a 95-kilogram man. What is indisputable is that the question itself was interesting to everyone who had spent serious time thinking about fighting. The combination of their respective gifts, Lee's speed and precision and his rejection of any fixed form, Ali's power and endurance and his revolutionary approach to movement, would have produced something genuinely unprecedented. That is what the imagination responds to. Not a winner. An event. A meeting of two philosophies so sophisticated, so individually developed, so perfectly refined within their respective disciplines, that the outcome would have told you something true about the nature of combat itself. They never got to have that conversation. The story behind the story, so where does the legend come from? Why does the myth of the secret fight, in a darkened auditorium, with 7 witnesses or 47 witnesses or some other sealed, intimate number, keep circulating, keep getting embellished, keep finding new audiences? Part of the answer is obvious. These were two of the most compelling human beings of the 20th century. Ali was the most documented athlete in the world during the late 1960s and 1970s. There were cameras on him constantly, reporters following him everywhere, his face on the cover of Sports Illustrated 38 times, more than any other athlete except Michael Jordan. And Bruce Lee was, in the years immediately following his death, becoming something even rarer than a celebrity. He was becoming a myth. Enter the Dragon was released 1 month after his death. The film became a worldwide phenomenon, grossing what would today be the equivalent of over $2 billion on a budget of less than $1 million. The man who made it never saw it in its final form. When two figures of that magnitude exist in the same era, when they are both, in their separate worlds, operating at the absolute edge of what human beings are supposed to be capable of, the imagination insists they must have intersected. The idea that they might have lived parallel lives, admired each other from a distance, and simply never occupied the same room is somehow unsatisfying. It feels like a story that was supposed to happen and didn't. And so people fill the gap. They fill it with the image of a locked room. They fill it with witnesses sworn to silence. They fill it with the particular American mythology of the secret event, the hidden truth that only a few chosen people witnessed, that ordinary evidence cannot reach, that lives in the whispered accounts of those who were there. The story also draws power from something specifically true. The genuine mystery surrounding both men. Ali's 3-year exile from boxing, what happened to him during those missing years, what fights he might have had that were never recorded. Bruce Lee's death at 32, just before his greatest film was released, just as the world was catching up to what he had made. What would he have done next? Both men existed partially in shadow, and shadows invite projection. There is also the June reconnection, which is real and documented, and which gives the myth a factual anchor to attach itself to. If Bruce Lee's technique reached Muhammad Ali through a third party, the imagination wonders. What else might have passed between them through channels we can't see? What if they were closer together than history recorded? What they gave the world separate from the myth, separate from the argument, there's what these two men actually built and left behind, and it is extraordinary. Bruce Lee effectively invented mixed martial arts. Dana White, the founder of the UFC, said precisely that in 2004. The entire competitive philosophy of the UFC, the argument that the best fighter is whoever can absorb useful techniques from every discipline rather than remain loyal to one system, is Jeet Kune Do applied to competition. Anderson Silva cited Lee as a primary inspiration. John Jones incorporated a technique Lee popularized, the oblique kick to the knee, as one of his most effective weapons. Fighters from Georges St-Pierre to Conor McGregor have described Lee as foundational to how they think about fighting. His book, Tao of Jeet Kune Do, compiled from his notes, and published posthumously in 1975, is still in print and still taught in martial arts programs around the world. More broadly, Bruce Lee changed the way the West thought about Asian men. He arrived in Hollywood at a time when Asian male characters in American films were either villains, comic relief, or invisible. He was none of those things. He was the hero. He was fast and strong and charismatic and deeply, openly proud of being Chinese at a moment when that required genuine courage. The ripple effects of that, across cinema, across culture, across the self-image of generations of Asian American children who grew up watching him, are genuinely incalculable. Muhammad Ali changed what athletes were allowed to be. Before Ali, the expectation for a professional boxer, for any professional athlete, was that you did your job, you collected your check, and you kept your political opinions to yourself. Ali refused. He stood in front of the most powerful government in the world and said he would not fight in a war he did not believe in, and he paid an enormous price for it, and then he was proved right, and then the world caught up to him. His willingness to sacrifice the peak years of his career for a principle he believed in is the reason athletes today understand themselves as having something meaningful to say about the world they live in. He was also, in purely athletic terms, something close to the ceiling of what a human body in a boxing ring can accomplish. His footwork, which Bruce Lee studied so obsessively, remains the benchmark by which boxing movement is measured. His chin, his endurance, his ability to absorb punishment and continue thinking clearly, his strategic intelligence in the ring, these were not merely superior to his contemporaries. They were superior to almost everyone who has competed in heavyweight boxing before or since. Two men who never met. Who shared a mutual connection in Junri, who connected through a secret punch that one of them developed and the other used to knock out a champion. Who, in a very specific and verifiable sense, are part of the same story even though their paths never physically crossed. The truth is stranger. The last thing worth saying is this. The version of events that actually happened, the documented, verified, unglamorous truth of Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali's relationship, is more interesting than the myth. It does not require a locked auditorium or sworn witnesses or a secret carried to the grave. It requires only paying attention to what was really there. A man standing in front of a mirror at 3 a.m, watching footage of a boxer he outweighed by 65 pounds, throwing combinations at his own reflection. Thinking, I would never beat him. Thinking, I need to understand how he does what he does. Doing that work because the work mattered, not because a fight was scheduled, not because anyone was watching. A punch developed in a basement in Seattle or Los Angeles, refined over years of scientific thinking about the human nervous system, handed to a Korean grandmaster as part of a decade-long friendship, carried in that grandmaster's muscle memory for 2 years after the man who invented it was gone, and then demonstrated in a training camp in Pennsylvania to the heavyweight champion of the world, who immediately recognized that it could not be blocked and immediately asked to be taught it. A technique that traveled from Bruce Lee's hands through Junri's hands into Muhammad Ali's hands and then into the chin of a British champion in a fight broadcast around the world. That is the actual story of Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali. It is not as dramatic as a locked room with 7 witnesses. But it is real. And real things, when they are this extraordinary, do not need the decoration of legend. Both men are gone now. Ali died on June 3, 2016, after years of living with Parkinson's syndrome, a condition that his doctors believed was connected to the decades of punishment his body absorbed in the ring. Lee died on July 20, 1973, at 32 years old, 6 days before the Hong Kong premiere of Enter the Dragon. Neither of them had a complete conversation about what they saw in each other, because the conversation never got to happen. But something passed between them anyway. Through a third man, through a punch, through the hours Bruce Lee spent in front of that mirror. Something moved from one legend to the other, across the space that separated them. That is, in the end, a more beautiful story than the one about the locked auditorium. It just requires you to pay attention to what was actually there. If this video got you thinking about the real history of two of the greatest who ever lived, drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who would want to hear stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we go this deep every single time. And if there is a martial arts legend you think deserves this kind of treatment, leave it in the comments. We read every single one. See you in the next video.